Most of modern history, global trade has followed an unspoken rule. Nothing moves freely unless someone powerful allows it to. Tariffs, quotas, customs regulations, they are often presented as technical details, but in reality, they decide who gets to industrialize and who stays trapped exporting raw materials forever. For decades, Africa existed on the wrong side of those rules. The continent was rich in land, in labor, in minerals, in potential. Yet African countries struggled to sell anything beyond raw resources to the world's largest markets. Then, almost quietly, China made a move that seemed to violate everything economists believed about national self-interest. It erased tariffs. Not partially, not symbolically, but almost completely. A 100% zero-duty policy for dozens of African nations. No major power had ever done this at such scale. No conditions tied to democracy, no public demand for loyalty. To some, it looked like generosity. To others, it looked like manipulation. To many policymakers in the West, it barely registered at all. But this decision was neither charity nor coincidence. It was a strategic calculation, built on history, memory, and long-term power. This is the story of why China scrapped tariffs for Africa, and why that decision may quietly reshape the global economic order. Trade is often described as neutral, as numbers on spreadsheets, as ships moving across oceans, as supply and demand. But trade has never been neutral. From the earliest empires to the modern global economy, trade has always been about control. Who sets the rules? Who has access? Who captures value? The British Empire understood this when it controlled sea lanes and imposed tariffs to protect its industries. The United States understood it after World War II, when it helped design a global trade system that favored industrialized economies while presenting it as free and open. China understands it now. By the early 2000s, China had already become the world's factory. By the 2010s, it dominated global supply chains. But by the 2020s, the environment had changed. Trade wars intensified, sanctions expanded, technology restrictions multiplied. Words like decoupling and de-risking entered official policy. China was no longer being integrated into the system, it was being contained. Faced with this reality, China had two options. It could retreat inward, or it could build alternative economic relationships outside the traditional Western core. Africa became central to that choice. After World War II, global trade rules were designed around industrialized economies. The logic was simple and brutal. Developed countries exported manufactured goods. Developing countries exported raw materials. Value flowed upward. Risk flowed downward. Tariffs enforced this structure. When developing countries exported raw commodities, tariffs were low. When they tried to export finished products, tariffs rose sharply. This phenomenon had a name: tariff escalation. It meant African countries could sell cocoa beans easily, but faced heavy barriers selling chocolate. They could sell raw copper, but struggled to sell finished electrical components. This wasn't a failure of ambition or effort. It was a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. By the time most African nations gained independence in the 1950s and 60s, the rules were already written. New flags were raised, but the economic structure remained colonial. By the 1980s and 90s, many African economies were deeply integrated into global trade,
but only as suppliers of low-value inputs. Attempts at industrialization faced three barriers: limited capital, weak infrastructure, restricted access to foreign markets. Even when African countries managed to build factories, they struggled to sell their products competitively abroad. Without access, factories closed. Without factories, jobs disappeared. Without jobs, poverty deepened. This cycle became self-reinforcing.
For African economies, being locked out of major markets carried a hidden cost that rarely appeared in official statistics. It wasn't just lost revenue, it was lost learning. When countries cannot export competitively, their firms never reach the scale required to improve productivity. Workers don't acquire industrial skills. Managers don't learn how to operate within global standards. Entire generations remain disconnected from modern supply chains. This is why market access matters more than subsidies. Without consistent exposure to demanding markets, industries stagnate, innovation slows, risk-taking disappears. Entrepreneurs stop building for the world and settle for survival at home. China understood this dynamic intimately, because the moment Chinese factories gained stable access to global markets, everything changed. Productivity rose, skills accumulated, capital followed confidence. Africa had never been given that same sustained opportunity. Zero tariffs didn't promise success, but they removed the single most powerful obstacle: exclusion. For decades, the dominant Western response to Africa's economic challenges was aid. Billions of dollars flowed into development programs, humanitarian assistance, and institutional reform. Some of it helped, much of it didn't. Aid treated symptoms, not structure. It built schools, but not industries. It funded clinics, but not export capacity. It addressed poverty without addressing why African economies struggled to generate wealth in the first place. China observed this carefully, and it reached a different conclusion. Economic transformation does not begin with aid. It begins with production, and production requires markets. Trade is often treated as an outcome. Exports rise, numbers improve, graphs move upward. But in reality, trade is a learning process. Countries don't become competitive by accident. They learn by doing, by failing, by adjusting, and by trying again under real market pressure. This process cannot happen in isolation. When firms export, they learn about quality requirements, packaging standards, delivery schedules, and cost control. When they miss deadlines or fail inspections, the feedback is immediate and unforgiving. For decades, African firms were denied this learning environment, not because they lacked talent, but because they lacked access. Zero tariffs did not instantly create competitive industries. What they created was exposure, repeated, measurable exposure to the realities of global trade. And exposure, over time, becomes capability. Before we go further, let me pause for just a moment. Stories like this, about trade, power, and long-term strategy, are rarely told in full. They're often reduced to headlines, sound bites, or political talking points. This channel exists to do the opposite. Here, we slow things down. We follow the incentives. We trace decisions back to their roots and forward to their consequences. If you value long-form analysis, global economics, and stories that explain why the world works the way it does, not just what happened, then consider subscribing. Not for notifications, not for trends, but for context. Now, let's continue. Market access does more than open doors. It creates discipline. When producers know they are selling into competitive, demanding markets, standards rise automatically. Quality control improves, timelines tighten, waste becomes expensive, efficiency stops being optional. This is why protected markets often stagnate. China's own transformation followed this pattern.
Once Chinese firms were forced to compete globally, survival depended on improvement. Weak companies disappeared, strong ones adapted. Africa, for decades, was shielded from this pressure, not by protection, but by exclusion. Zero tariffs introduced a new kind of accountability. African exporters selling into China could no longer rely on proximity or preference. They had to meet standards, volumes, and deadlines. This pressure was not punishment, it was training. And training, repeated at scale, is how industries are built. China did not approach Africa as an outsider. It approached Africa as a country that remembered exclusion. In the 1980s and 90s, China was still a poor, export-dependent economy. Chinese goods faced high tariffs, strict quotas, frequent anti-dumping cases. Western markets opened gradually and selectively. China learned two lessons during this period. First, market access accelerates growth faster than aid. Second, trade rules are political tools, not neutral laws. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it gained something far more valuable than tariff reductions. It gained experience. It saw how preferential access allowed industries to scale, how integration into supply chains transferred skills and technology, how exports created jobs at massive scale. China never forgot that experience, and when it looked at Africa, it saw a familiar pattern. To many Western policymakers, Africa represented risk. To China, Africa represented time. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. Its population is projected to double by mid-century. By 2035, Africa will have the world's largest workforce. This demographic reality creates pressure. Either jobs are created at scale, or instability grows. China understood that industrialization in Africa was not optional, it was inevitable. The question was, who would shape it? If African countries industrialized using Western systems, standards, and supply chains, China would remain an outsider. If they industrialized through Chinese capital, machinery, and logistics, China would become indispensable. Tariffs became the entry point. For years, infrastructure was treated as the missing key to Africa's development. Roads, ports, railways, built at massive scale, often with Chinese financing. But infrastructure alone does not create growth. A port without export demand is just concrete by the sea. A railway without buyers is steel without purpose. What China's zero-tariff policy changed was the logic of infrastructure itself. Suddenly, roads led somewhere, ports had destinations, railways connected production to demand. Factories that once operated below capacity now had a reason to expand. Logistics networks that existed in theory began to function in practice. Infrastructure stopped being a sunk cost and became a productive asset. Trade access completed the circuit. And once that circuit was closed, production, transport, market, the economic equation fundamentally changed. What made China's decision especially powerful was not only the policy itself, but its timing. The zero-tariff move came at a moment when global trade was fragmenting. Supply chains were under pressure. Companies were searching for alternatives to over-concentration. Political risk was being priced into every shipment. Africa, long ignored, suddenly became relevant. But relevance without access means nothing. China's policy arrived precisely when African countries were beginning to invest in infrastructure, regional trade agreements, and industrial capacity. The groundwork had been laid, but the door remained closed. Zero tariffs opened that door. Not dramatically, not overnight, but decisively. For the first time, African producers could imagine exporting not as an exception, but as a strategy. That psychological shift was just as important as the economic one. China's zero-tariff policy did not appear overnight. It evolved. First, preferential treatment for least developed countries, then expanded product coverage, then simplified customs procedures. Finally, the announcement that mattered: almost all tariff lines reduced to zero for agriculture, for light manufacturing, for processed goods. This decision sent a clear signal. Africa was no longer just a source of raw materials. It was being invited into China's market as a producer. It is important to understand what zero tariffs did and what they did not do. They did not guarantee success. They did not eliminate domestic challenges. They did not replace the need for good policy. What they did was remove the external ceiling. For the first time, African countries could fail or succeed on largely internal terms. If exports grew, it would be because production improved. If they stagnated, the reason would be local, not structural exclusion. That distinction matters, because responsibility follows opportunity. China's policy shifted the narrative. Africa was no longer unable to export. It was now learning to export. And learning, by definition, takes time. But once the ceiling is removed, progress, however uneven, becomes possible. From the outside, the decision looked dangerous. Why expose domestic producers to foreign competition? The answer lies in scale. African exports to China were tiny relative to China's economy. They posed no immediate threat, but their growth potential was enormous. China was not afraid of African competition. It was betting on African integration. If African countries industrialized, they would require Chinese machinery, Chinese logistics, Chinese financing. Zero tariffs were not a concession. They were an investment. At first glance, the increase in African exports to China looked modest. The numbers did not shock global markets. They did not trigger headlines. They did not rewrite balance sheets overnight. But this misses how development actually works. Industrial growth rarely begins with dramatic leaps. It begins with small, repeatable wins. One factory, one contract, one reliable buyer. Each successful export creates confidence. Confidence attracts investment. Investment improves capacity. This is how momentum is built. China understood that even limited export growth could trigger a chain reaction inside African economies. What mattered was not scale at the beginning, but continuity. Zero tariffs didn't aim for explosion. They aimed for accumulation. Every development strategy is ultimately about risk. Who bears it? Who absorbs early losses? And who waits for long-term returns? China's zero-tariff approach quietly shifted risk away from African producers. Instead of forcing them to compete immediately against established global giants, it reduced the cost of entry. It lowered the penalty for failure. This mattered. Young industries cannot survive under full competitive pressure from day one. They need space to learn, to adjust, to stabilize. By absorbing short-term trade imbalances, China effectively underwrote Africa's learning phase. This was not charity. It was calculated risk transfer. China accepted temporary asymmetry in exchange for future supply relationships, political capital, and long-term market integration. Risk was not eliminated. It was repositioned. By scrapping tariffs, China wasn't just changing trade flows, it was changing expectations. It was telling African countries, we won't give you aid, we'll give you access. That distinction mattered, because access creates memory, and memory shapes alliances. We will move deeper into real country case studies, hard numbers, winners and losers, and the global reaction to China's boldest trade experiment. Policies matter only when they change behavior. China's zero-tariff decision was no exception. Within the first few years of implementation, African exports to China began to shift, not dramatically, but meaningfully. Agricultural exports increased first. Coffee, sesame seeds, nuts, fruits, and processed food products found faster entry into Chinese ports. But the real change was psychological. For the first time, African exporters could plan for scale. Previously, uncertainty killed ambition. Tariffs could rise overnight. Rules could change without notice. Zero tariffs removed a critical variable. Exporters could calculate margins. Governments could justify industrial parks. Investors could see long-term potential. This wasn't a trade boom. It was the beginning of predictability. And predictability is the foundation of industrialization.
Ethiopia offers one of the clearest examples of how China's strategy played out on the ground. For decades, Ethiopia relied heavily on aid. Exports were limited. Manufacturing was minimal. Then came industrial parks. With Chinese financing and construction, Ethiopia built large-scale manufacturing zones focused on textiles, leather, and light industry. But factories alone don't matter if there's nowhere to sell. China's zero-tariff access changed that equation. Ethiopian garment exports to China faced no tariff barriers. Shipping routes were optimized. Chinese firms provided machinery and training. The result was not immediate prosperity, but structural change. Jobs were created. Export capacity expanded. Foreign exchange earnings stabilized. Most importantly, Ethiopia shifted from asking, "How much aid can we get?" to asking, "How much can we produce?" That shift is irreversible.
One of the least visible effects of market access is the spread of standards. Every market has them: technical specifications, safety rules, packaging norms, certification processes. These standards quietly shape how industries operate. When African exporters began selling into China, they didn't just ship goods, they absorbed systems. Factories adapted to Chinese technical requirements, producers adjusted to inspection regimes, logistics firms aligned with new timelines. Over time, these standards became embedded. This matters because standards travel. Once firms meet them for one market, they can often adapt them for others. Skills compound, capabilities transfer. China's zero-tariff policy did more than move products. It transmitted operational knowledge at scale. And knowledge, once acquired, cannot be tariffed away. Not all African countries benefited equally. Kenya and Rwanda had fewer natural resources, but stronger institutions. China's zero-tariff policy rewarded that difference. Kenya expanded exports of processed agricultural goods, tea-based consumer products, light manufactured components. Rwanda focused on specialty agriculture, assembly-based manufacturing, export logistics. Neither country became an industrial giant, but both gained something more important: integration into regional value chains. Chinese firms used Kenya as a logistics hub. Rwanda positioned itself as a testing ground for small-scale manufacturing. Zero tariffs gave these strategies credibility. They weren't exporting charity products, they were exporting competitively.
Zambia reveals the limits of the policy. Zambia is rich in copper, but resource dependence runs deep. Zero tariffs did not magically diversify Zambia's economy. Most exports remained raw or semi-processed. But even here, something changed. China increased imports of processed copper products, not just ore. Smelting capacity expanded. Local processing increased. The lesson was clear. Zero tariffs help most where governments align policy with production. They are not a shortcut. They are an amplifier.
Critics often ask, doesn't China benefit more than Africa? In the short term, yes. Chinese firms sell machinery, finance infrastructure, control logistics. But this misses the larger point. Trade is not a zero-sum game,
But power accumulation is not equal. China benefits from supply chain diversification, political goodwill, long-term market expansion. Africa benefits from market access, export learning, industrial capacity. The timeline matters. China is playing a 30-year game. Africa is just entering the first decade.
China's zero-tariff move was not just economic. It was diplomatic. Without speeches or military presence, China sent a signal. We see you as producers, not dependents. That message resonated at the United Nations, at trade negotiations, at climate forums. African countries didn't suddenly become Chinese allies, but they became less Western-aligned by default. Influence shifted, not through coercion, but through access. This was soft power, built on logistics, not ideology.
Eventually, Western governments noticed. The European Union expanded trade preferences. The United States revisited AGOA. Japan increased development-linked trade finance. Competition returned to Africa. That was not an accident. China expected this reaction. In fact, it welcomed it. Because when powerful actors compete for access to your market, you gain leverage. Africa gained leverage.
Zero tariffs are not free. China accepted several risks: domestic producer pressure, quality control challenges, smuggling, and mislabeling. But these risks were manageable because China wasn't betting on immediate profit. It was betting on structural dependency. If African exports grow through Chinese systems, China remains indispensable, even if competition increases.
Could the West do the same? In theory, yes. In practice, no. Western trade policy is constrained by domestic politics, lobby pressure, short electoral cycles. China's centralized system allows patience. Zero tariffs require trust in the future. China has that.
Perhaps the most underestimated element of this strategy is patience. Most trade policies are designed for short political cycles. Results are expected quickly. If gains are not visible, policies are reversed. China operates differently. Its zero-tariff approach accepted slow beginnings, uneven outcomes, and delayed returns. This was not a flaw, it was the design. Africa's development would not be linear. Some countries would move faster, others would struggle. China was willing to wait. That patience created asymmetry. While others measured success in quarterly figures, China measured it in structural shifts. Factories built, supply chains extended, habits formed. And once those habits exist, they are remarkably difficult to undo.
China did not scrap tariffs because it was generous. It did so because it understood something fundamental about power. The future does not belong to those who extract the most today. It belongs to those who shape how others grow tomorrow. Africa was not the recipient of charity. It was the cornerstone of a long-term strategy. A strategy built on access over aid, markets over lectures, integration over isolation. The 100% zero-duty policy was a bet on Africa's growth, a bet on shifting global trade, a bet that power, in the 21st century, would flow through supply chains, not armies. That bet is still unfolding, but one thing is already clear: global trade will never look the same again.